So hi, everybody. I'm Paul Grand, if you don't know me already, CEO of MedTech Innovator. We are a MedTech accelerator focused on startups from all over the world. So we have what we consider to be the best startups from ecosystems all over not only the United States, but also Europe. We have startups from Australia, as far as Australia this year. So we're really lucky to have incredible companies in our program. Our job is to connect the best startups in the entire world with the best MedTech ecosystem in the world, and to bring them resources that'll help them in their journey towards reaching patients. And we're really lucky to have incredible people in this ecosystem who give their time and expertise. And the format we use for that, or one of the vehicles for that, is this webinar series, MedTech Innovator Live. I'm joined today by some incredible panelists, who I'm going to introduce in a moment. We're going to be talking today about gathering evidence. And so specifically, some of the evidence that's needed both to bring your product to regulatory approval, to bring your product to the market. When we look at technology, we always see one of the biggest challenges. You can have an amazing technology, but if you don't have the right evidence, not only we may not get approval, but if you get approval, you need to have the right evidence to convince the market. So we're going to talk today a little bit about some of the strategies involved in gathering that evidence, and even knowing what the right evidence is in the first place. So let me start off by introducing our panelists for today. So first off, I'm going to introduce Billy Cohn. Dr. Cohn, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about you, both in your capacity as a surgeon, but also CDI, Johnson & Johnson, and so on.
Okay, thanks a lot, Paul. Hello, everyone. My name is Billy Cohn. I am a Vice President of Medical Devices at Jaye and the Executive Director of the Center for Device Innovation. And hopefully throughout the course of this webinar, I'll get a couple plugs in for CDI. But historically, I grew up in Houston, Texas, which when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, sort of the epicenter of heart surgery in the free world. And so I actually decided to pursue that path and became a heart surgeon. I did all 11 years of my training here at Baylor College of Medicine, right in the hub of the Texas Medical Center. For those of you that don't know, the Texas Medical Center is the largest medical center on planet Earth. About 106,000 people show up to work here every day. And so during those 11 years training to be a heart surgeon under legendary heart surgeons like Michael DeBakey and E. Stanley Crawford, I got to see a lot of innovation, got to see a lot of startup companies. A lot of them started in Houston and then went to the West Coast or to Boston. But it was very exciting for me, and I decided to craft my professional career in that image. I then went to Boston, where I became a heart surgeon, an attending heart surgeon at the Beth Israel Deaconess. And over the next 11 or 12 years, invented a lot of stuff. I fancy myself a MedTech inventor, and turned some of those into startups. Some of them were monumental wastes of my time and other people's money, but some of them turned into products that were used to help patients in my hospital and all over the world. 15 years ago, I had an opportunity to move back to Houston to help work on the world's first practical permanent artificial heart. And through the next 15 years, did several more startups that put me on Johnson & Johnson's radar. So 2 years ago, I transitioned from a full-time clinical role to leading this beautiful facility that you can see behind me. This is the Center for Device Innovation. It's just on the edge of the Texas Medical Center, about a mile from the center of the medical center, where we're doing cutting-edge development and ideation of medical device ideas, leveraging the Texas Medical Center, leveraging the incredible wealth of experience and talent in Johnson & Johnson, the world's largest health tech company, and with a room full of very innovative engineers and clinicians that are proceeding with a sense of urgency. So I'm happy to be here and happy to be part of this panel, Paul, and eager to answer some hard questions.
Excellent, Billy. We are extremely lucky to have you on this webinar and to be part of the MedTech Innovator ecosystem. All of our startups hopefully will be lucky enough to have a chance to meet you if they haven't already. I'm sure plenty of them have met you in various capacities, but hopefully they get a chance to meet you in person as well, perhaps the MedTech conference later this year. So until then, this will have to do. So let's then move on to the Proxima team. So the Proxima team, We've been very lucky to add to the MedTech Innovator ecosystem this year as one of our newer partners. Proxima is an CRO, but I'll tell you more about what they do as a company in a moment. I just wanted to mention that as we've traveled around the road to meet companies all over not only the United States, but also Europe as part of our program this year, the Proxima team was right there with us. We were very excited to have you guys as part of our team. So let me go ahead and introduce Jaye, Isabella, and Matt. I'll let you guys each introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about Proxima as well.
Hello, I'm Jaye Thompson, and I'm a co-founder and COO for Proxima. And Proxima Clinical Research is a contract research organization that focuses on the needs of emerging companies. We help in the areas of regulatory affairs and clinical trials. Now, the reason that we started Proxima was because we found a real unmet medical need that we saw that companies needed somebody to walk side by side with them as they move through development. So that's our purpose. Now, personally, my background in the industry is today is my 31st anniversary of being in the industry. I just realized that this morning. And I've been doing this for a long time. I started in this industry as a statistician doing statistics and data management, and then moved into clinical trial management and also interacting with the Food and Drug Administration on a regular basis. I am also an entrepreneur, and that this is my second CRO to found, and it's been a real pleasure to kick this off and to work with MTI. We're happy to be here. Isabella?
My name is Isabella Schmitt. I started off my career, I guess, in a research lab at university doing nanomaterials for cancer therapies. I worked there for a few years. Then after that, I worked at a small biopharma company. Well, small is relative, I guess. It was about like 40 people. And then I did manufacturing, regulatory, and clinical there. Then after that, I worked at a small device company, again, about 30 people. And then I started at Proxima, where I do pretty much everything regulatory at Proxima. Go ahead, Matt.
And I'm Matt Wagener. I'm our Vice President of Clinical Operations at Proxima. So I've got oversight of all of our clinical trial solutions that we provide to our customers, early startups that we work with. So I have a background working in the CRO space. Prior to Proxima, worked with another CRO here in the industry. And then before that, worked in the site management organization space as well. And I've also worked in early clinical and the academic research centers here in Houston. So kind of like Billy, I'm a Houston native as well. So I'm growing up right here in the space. Been here all of my career right here in Houston, just enjoying all that we have to offer here in the Texas medical ecosystem.
Excellent. Well, we've been lucky enough to spend some time down in the Texas Medical Center ecosystem, specifically over at Texas Medical Center's TMCX facility, as well as a little time ducking in and out of CDI with Billy over there. I expect that we really would be lucky to spend some more time there. And I'm hoping that a bunch of our companies have the opportunity to do so as well. So as Billy mentioned so well, it is the largest innovation hub for medical technology probably these days in the world, and just medical research, hospitals, etc. I mean, it's an unbelievable facility. Every time I drive through there, it feels like I'm driving through Las Vegas, except instead of casinos, they're all hospitals. It's a pretty amazing place. So you guys are all lucky to be there in such an amazing ecosystem. So let's talk about gathering clinical evidence. So one of the things that I mentioned kind of in that little intro is that gathering the right evidence is everything, right? People are starting companies and they've got a budget and they're putting together some research plans to gather some evidence. How do you know you're gathering the right evidence, and how do you validate that strategy? So maybe I'll start off, Jaye and Isabella. Maybe one of you guys want to tackle that.
Certainly, I'll give it a try. So these emerging companies that we interact with, they have limited resources, both in bandwidth of employees and staff, but certainly money. And so it is crucial that we apply those resources in precisely the right way. And so when it comes to going forward with clinical development, we certainly encourage our clients to build a clinical development plan. Sit down and think about what is really necessary versus what's very interesting science, and what's going to be necessary and useful along your regulatory pathway. So this also needs to be a clinical plan that is validated with the different regulatory agencies that you expect to be interacting with. Maybe it's Europe is your first market, or the US, and try to overlap those as much as possible.
So in other words, they should reach out and do like a pre-sub meeting with the FDA, you're saying, before they do their first studies?
Oh, absolutely. I would try to invest as little money as possible in even some of your animal work before you interact with the FDA. You're going to want to make sure that you spend every bit of that carefully. And a pre-submission meeting, the FDA is it's very easy to get in to talk to them these days, and so you want to take advantage of that as much as you can.
Yeah, we saw yesterday, we had another webinar that AdvaMed put together, and they were talking about pre-sub specifically, and I think the data point for this year, like at the halfway point of the year, was something like, as of halfway, they had over 2,800 pre-sub requests this year at FDA, which is pretty incredible. And they're taking as many of those meetings as they can, obviously. So it's a great resource, and it's free. So I encourage people to leverage that. Billy, I'm just going to ask you quickly, as an innovator yourself, a serial innovator, before you go diving into doing some animal work or whatever model you're choosing, what do you do to validate your plans for those studies, or do you just know at this point?
No, I mean, just to echo what you said before, the FDA is preaching early and often. And if you actually head down the path and do a bunch of animal stuff and a bunch of design stuff and then meet with them, they'll be critical of you for not meeting early. So it's a resource, it's there, they're open to it. Just, I couldn't agree with you guys more. As far as animal studies, it's a real challenge because for most of the illnesses that we're trying to treat, there is no good animal model. And it could go either way. It could be really easy to get really impressive results with animals and then be prohibitively difficult in humans, or the opposite way. It's almost impossible to do the animals, and then when you finally get into clinical work, you find that, oh man, this is a piece of cake. And so Tom Fogarty, one of my mentors, and others with a lot of gray hair in this field say, race to first in man. You have to do it ethically, so you have to know that what you're doing has scientific merit and keep the patient right in the center. But spending a lot of time working out details in an animal model is probably a poor plan. Do as much animal work as you need to know that morally you're doing something good and that it makes sense. Have all sorts of backup contingencies available so you don't prima non nocere, don't hurt any patients, but race to first in man.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. Also I could tell you, as an investor, as someone who's a VC for almost 12 years, the biggest thing that makes you crazy is when, we know, from our research what work someone should have done, and we know what data we need to see to make a decision, and they don't have it. And they could have done it. They had the funding perhaps to do it, and they just didn't get the advice from the people they needed to actually validate, what data somebody was going to want to see. So validation is really important. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the other pitfalls before we get into some of the detailed questions. Maybe again, I'll go to the Proxima folks for this. What are some of the pitfalls? You guys work with all these early stage startups. I know at Proxima specifically, that's your focus and your passion. So what are some of the biggest pitfalls that early stage startups are doing, preclinical work, clinical work? What are some of the biggest pitfalls they encounter, common mistakes, things that you can give advice now that you wish you had told people, or you wish you had been able to give to people that perhaps have made some mistakes along the way. So help us avoid those mistakes now. Give us some tips.
Sure, I'll chime in on that. So as far as the biggest pitfalls, some of the biggest pitfalls that we see is really just not planning your study carefully and really taking into account all that needs to go into it. So how are you going to actually execute? How are you going to collect that data? And preparing for the timeline that's appropriate. A lot of times companies will believe that their company is going to be the exception to the rule. They're going to get there, and they're going to do it quicker than anybody else did it. They're going to enroll that subject, that patient population, faster than anybody else has done it in history. So they're just not really planning effectively. So I think that's just one of those biggest pitfalls that they have, that they really have a bright idea, something that's truly innovative, and we want to help support that, but really that lack of planning and then those bright eyes leading to a little bit of kind of overconfidence that you can do it quicker than the last guy did. And some of that's out of your control. Some of it's just patient population that you're dealing with, and you really just have to understand that. So planning effectively, planning your timeline effectively, so that you can get the study done in the right amount of time and not have to go back to your investors and say, I need an extra certain amount of money to finish this study because it's taking me an extra 6 to 12 months to get it done. That's something that could have been avoided.
Yeah, good advice. You mentioned investment. Oh, sorry, Jay, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to point out that issue of being the exception to the rule is something that we find clients also thinking about with regard to the regulatory interactions. They tend to think that because our product is so neat and it's so novel that somehow the FDA is just going to give them a pass because they're so special. And so we really want everybody to take a dose of, of reality and realize that you're likely to be held to the similar standards of companies in the similar spaces. And so just keep that in mind.
Yep, good advice. We all like to think we're special, but in the end, we all have to play by the rules. So, Billy, I was mentioning a minute ago about investors. And one question I have, I know you're somebody who, as I said, you've done this a lot of times. How investors do you think, how involved should investors be in things like study design?
Okay, can I back up and just say something about mistakes?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, one mistake that I see over and over again is people spending a lot of time and effort really refining a device before doing animals.
Yeah.
And then finding out, oh, this is tragically flawed. This whole thesis is wrong. And all that work was for naught. So I encourage in the animal phase, get in super early with things that aren't really well fleshed out. And you realize that whole parts of them are tragically flawed and you need to do a big pivot. So don't start your study until all that's in the rear view mirror. You can spend all this time refining something that you're doing on the bench and then go in and find out it's tragically flawed. Get into the animal lab early, pivot over and over again. Don't flesh it out till it's right. And certainly don't start your study until you know what it's going to show. You gotta have made all the mistakes already before you start your study. And clinically, that's even more important. So about investors, the word investor is kind of like the word cancer. It encompasses a lot of things. Not putting the word investor in a pejorative sense. I think investors are wonderful, but some of them are highly sophisticated, understand this field and medical device startups really well. They've got a huge Rolodex. They've made all the mistakes and can spot a challenge way before you get to it and avoid it. Others have a lot of money. They've been very successful in video rental or pet supplies, and they think that somehow makes them a business master that's going to help you. So, and then there's everything in between. So the ones that are sophisticated and have a Rolodex in the boardroom, they will weigh in, and even before you've taken in money, if you're anticipating taking money from them, get them involved. They can help you. They can help you immensely. If they don't have the expertise, you need to give them the illusion that you're listening to them and they're being helpful because you want their money just the same. So investors can be super, super helpful if they have the skill set.
Yeah, and I think in my experience as well, it's it's setting expectations as well. So you mentioned before about kind of validating what the study's supposed to do, what it should accomplish. Make sure people are all on the same page so that if you do what you said you were going to do and it doesn't work out, everyone's on the same page. They can't just sit there and go, well, I'm done.
Absolute transparency.
100%.
Never fib, never stretch the truth internally. You can lie all you want when you're talking to the press or trying to, but you've got to be totally 5 by 5 when you're talking internally. Everybody's got to know everything good, everything bad, to the minute detail, because you don't want to have people thinking, well, you said things were going well. Well, they were going well. We just had this problem and I didn't mention it. If your investors lose confidence in you and you break that trust, then you're doomed.
Very good. Good advice. Let's not lie to anybody. Let's all be transparent. So let's talk about, a little more about, besides, other advisors or people who can give you input, KOLs. And Billy, I know in Texas and beyond Texas, you are a significant KOL, key opinion leader. How involved should your KOLs be in things like your study design?
So it's fundamental to get the KOLs involved and find out what they hear. But picking your KOLs, there's an art to that. Everybody wants to go to the top of the ladder and get the Vivek Reddy or somebody who's involved in everything. If they're involved in everything and they've got that much podium time, you get this much of their bandwidth, and their technologies that they're interested in, they're competitive with yours. So it's a give and a take when you go for the top guy. What I think you should go for is someone who's of that DNA, that pedigree, somebody who's going to be really famous, who no one has taken him into the tent yet, who's going to work indefatigably on your project for the right reasons because he thinks it's going to help him help his patient. You always got to keep the patient right in the middle. But the right KOL is all about results, all about his patients, and isn't already juggling 20 projects. So you get more of their bandwidth. You're their kingmaker. You're what's going to put them on the podium. You're their launch pad. So they help you, you help them. That's the kind of KOL you want. And later on, in one of the questions you asked, how much do you pay a KOL? What stock do you give them? The good KOLs will ask for nothing, and you give them stuff anyway. It's a symbiotic relationship. If they're doing it because they want to make money, they're probably not the right guys. You've got to get guys or gals who are working on the project because they believe in it and they want to be the person on the podium introducing it to the world. You say, well, that's a real unicorn, someone that's going to do it for free. I can tell you, I've been a KOL for so many companies and I've never asked for anything, and they've made it work out fine.
Great advice. And I know you're going to get 20 emails after this. People asking you.
I'm the kind of guy you don't want. I have no bandwidth.
So it's good that you made that point too. You got to have somebody who's on the rise instead of someone who's at the top. What about, Billy, actually one more on that point. So what about, when the founder of the company is themselves, a KOL of some kind, or considers himself a KOL? You still encourage them to reach out and bring other people into the fold before they just dive into it?
Totally. Because you get this thing where the clinician inventor is so enamored with his own thing. Everybody says he's not being objective. He's lost equipoise. He loves it because it's his. Bring in outside people. They will be able to say things from the podium that if you said, people would wouldn't find it credible. And you need to do a reality check. You may be deluded and infatuated with your own idea and it's not that good, and you should kick it to the curb and do something else. Or some of the features. I find when there is an inventor founder, and I've had this syndrome, and there's some unique, really clever thing you came up that's part of it, it may not be that good, it needs to be kicked to the curb no matter how unique and creative it was. You can't hang on to it because it's unique and creative. There may be a simple way that's been around forever and ever that works better, and only the outside people are going to tell you that. No one's going to say, my baby is ugly. Someone else can say, dude, you've got an ugly baby.
Right. Well, luckily, there's a lot of people who we know, and I know you know, that are willing to be transparent and tell people that their baby is a little ugly. It's a critical thing because, the truth is, I believe
you get that a lot when you were young.
I don't know. My parents may have gotten it. But the thing that I find is like one of the biggest enemies for startups is an ecosystem that just pats them in the back and says, great job, you're doing great. It gives them the big applause and doesn't tell them the truth. So they really need that. So great advice. So let's get into some of the weeds here on some of the questions that were submitted. We got a whole host of them that our startups sent in. As I always mention, that the questions we're going to talk about are ones that the startups in the MedTech Innovator cohort have submitted. So we're going to hit this kind of mailbag style and run through these. There's one specifically on the preclinical side, which I'll direct to Proxima. And one of the startups asked, where can guidance be found on IRB requirements for preclinical data? Where do you find that guidance?
So the guidance for, well, not the guidance, but the requirements for starting a clinical trial and the preclinical data that's required for that is really dependent on the IRB and the device that you're using. So the IRB will get all of the data that you've put together, all the preclinical data, and they'll review that, but each IRB may have specific requirements. So if you use a central IRB versus the university IRB, those two IRBs may require different things. If you're using multiple IRBs in one study, you might have to give each IRB a different amount of preclinical data. There's no hard and fast, like this is exactly what you need to do as far as preclinical data goes, but there is a guidance on animal studies that the FDA has put out that gives some information on animal models and the kinds of things that the FDA expects to see as far as animal studies go, but that doesn't necessarily speak to each individual IRB's requirements. And of course, you'll have to analyze the requirements based upon your device. What's the past precedent, that kind of thing.
So so when you're working with a company, then do you, who's got, all these different sites, how do you do that on their behalf, or what's the very quick kind of version of like who's the person that you call, or is there a place on the web, like what do you do?
As far as the IRB goes, like who to contact?
Yeah, is there like a
that one? Let me take.
As far as the IRB, I mean, you can work with folks like us, CROs, and they'll help you facilitate with those IRBs. Each institution is going to have their own requirements. Do they have their own IRB, or are they allowed to use, say, a central IRB? There's a lot of sites across the States, Canada, even in Europe, where you can use a centralized IRB and facilitate that. And even those central IRBs, they'll have a list of actually which sites that they work with as well. So that's a great place to go to and find out, okay, this KOL that I'm speaking to, I'm going to ask him maybe what his requirements are, a member on his team, if I'm going to potentially use them as a site. But as you're expanding outside of that, you can go to a couple of central IRBs and get a list. Okay, I need some sites that are going to get up and running quickly. And you can talk to the central IRBs and get a list as well and kind of know which ones are on their approved list already.
And one thing I'd add to that is individual IRBs also sometimes post their guidelines on the web, and so you may be able to do a quick research of whatever IRB you're using and find their guidelines, and that might give you some information onto what they're expecting to see from you and their rules overall.
And I would also add that I don't know that they have very many requirements that are not specific, that would be specific for the amount of animal data that would be necessary for a device study to start. I think it's all based on the safety profile of your product and the indication that you're studying, and there may be some where no animal data is necessary and very minimal proof of concept data. So it's a very broad answer.
And to Billy's point earlier, I guess it depends on the relevance of the animal model. So if you're using animal models that are not representative of the human model, then that animal data probably isn't going to be useful.
Yeah, could I add something? So in picking where you're going to do your work, there's a constellation of things you want. You need that person who's going to do the clinical stuff, and he's got to have that relationship with that IRB. If there's a hospital that has a difficult IRB, they don't do any of this kind of work, and they're not in the conversation. So if you've picked your hospital intelligently, people say, well, how do you pick programs, enrollment? It's the person who's going to do the case, who believes in it, and the IRB of that institution believes in that clinician. Because the IRB is never going to be sophisticated enough to understand all the technology that's going to be presented to them. They lean on their clinical guys or gals. If that clinical surgeon or believes in the technology, And maybe it's because of the animal stuff you showed them, or as you just pointed out, sometimes you don't have animal data because there is no good animal model. But if that clinician believes and has a good working relationship with the IRB, then that's where you do your study. There's some IRBs that never let anything come through until it's just so all the risk is behind and they don't get to do any early work. The other thing is, it's super important for the IRB, and will be for the clinician if they're a good doctor, that you have your contingency plans laid out, that you have triggers for abandoning the technology and going to the legacy conventional technology, and you have a branching algorithm of how nothing bad is going to happen to the patient. And if you show them you're doing that, they go, well, why wouldn't we get involved in this study? It's an opportunity to actually do the first on this in the planet, which helps our patients, which helps the profile of our hospital. But if this doesn't work, if that tissue doesn't hold, if this, they've got all sorts of contingency plans where the patient's going to get the conventional surgery. We're going to make sure the patient does well. So contingency plans, finding the right KOL with the right relationship with the right IRB, that's what it's all about.
It's great. So following up on that, then, Billy, you mentioned like finding, finding sites. So maybe for, I'll go back to Proxima on this one first. So how do you select sites then for studies?
It's a great question. So just piggybacking off of what Billy said too as well, that's a great place to start, right? With your KOLs, the physicians that you're already kind of speaking to, because you really want to gauge their interest in the program. So when you're selecting sites, it's kind of that balance between who's the KOL that you want to be on the name, and you want also you happy with them being at the podium at the end of the day representing your product potentially in publications, with the guys who are interested enough to enroll the study. So they have to have the enrollment potential to actually complete the study, and they have to have the right institution support as well. So you really want to do your research when you're selecting sites. So when you get ready to select your sites, really evaluate institutions where that patient population is going to be seen. Not every institution is going to have the same patient flow. So do your research, kind of understand your patient population, and kind of evaluate what site mix you want between maybe even hospital-based and community-based centers as well. That can really be a huge difference in patient flow, but it can also be a huge difference in timelines. Larger the center, the larger the political aspect of getting through their IRB or their contracting process. Those things can just take a little bit longer when you have an institution like that has that size, whereas other centers might be able to use a central IRB, and they might be a community-based center where you can do a contract in a week. So you can get them up and running relatively quickly. So really do your research when you're selecting your sites. Know that patient population, know how the sites actually work with their contracting, with their IRBs, and then just kind of evaluate, do you want to use that center overall or not? Get their real interest, and are they engaged with you in your product? Are they excited to be a part of that program? If they are at the beginning, they're usually going to be excited to enroll. And then just kind of lay out your expectations with them on what you expect as well up front with the site.
I'd add to that, the other balance that you have to make is sites who have a lot of experience in the specific indication and the specific type of device. Those are great, but if they have so many competitive studies, you're going to be competing for subjects. And so you want to make sure that the site is well-versed in the topic area, but not so much so that you're not getting the adequate enrollment and enough attention. There aren't enough coordinators at the site if they're running so many studies. So you kind of want to do a little bit of a vetting process on them too.
Great. So one of our startups asked, how do you get all these if you have multiple sites, how do you get them to play nice together? How do you align incentives? So maybe Matt on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, especially when you're dealing with a lot of personalities in different sites. Really the best thing you can do is set expectations up front with your site. So part of that might be a publication plan. So what is that plan for publication at the end of the day? You might have a couple of different guys who consider themselves KOLs, whether you do or not. So you're kind of dealing with those different egos. So set your expectations on how you're going to publish, how you're going to get to the podium. Maybe you've got the guy from the beginning and you know who that the guy is. Maybe you don't, or maybe you want to share some of that wealth. So maybe you've got another up-and-coming doc who would be a great supporter of your program. Well, if he's also a high enroller on your program, you want to incentivize him that way as well. So you can set that kind of goal that if they really are a lead enrolling center, they might be a part of that. So kind of set your expectations for publication time and speaking time. The other thing I would say to get them to play nice is really competitive enrollment.
Which isn't necessarily playing nice, it's sort of competing against each other, but it works.
It works. Yeah, it seems counterintuitive. You know, you think playing nice means, okay, you get 5 patients, you get 5 patients, you get 5 patients. Well, really, then you get a lag in really meeting your goal if one of those guys doesn't meet what you need them to. So really driving them, use their egos to the best of your advantage and set up competitive enrollment from the beginning. It's really going to be the best thing for you as a sponsor and innovator trying to get that study done, but ultimately it just sets the expectation up front. Yeah, this is for the patients ultimately that come through the clinic. So where the patient presents is where they get on study. So remind them that the patient's right at the center, and that usually helps keep them in mind as well.
I like it. All right, we'll talk more about competitive enrollment maybe another time. So let's talk here about another question that was asked, which is related to enrollment. And that's what's the common practice in the U.S. hospital system in participating in studies in regards to including patients? Do they just select from the regular patient flow? Are they using advertisements? How are they, actively approaching other hospitals? I mean, what's the mechanism that it's mainly done here in the U.S.? So let's start with that. Matt.
Yeah, so in the U.S., it is a little different than in Europe. You are allowed to advertise in different ways here in the States. So I'd say the first thing, though, is really evaluating the patient flow within the sites that you're looking at. So that's going to really inform you on what type of recruitment plan you want to put in place. You may or may not need to do advertising. There might be sites that have a real understanding of their patient flow. They understand how to access data in their EMR. And so they can actually go in and check, how many patients might I have that are eligible today to come onto this study and really look. So, but ultimately, it usually comes from just open enrollment within the practice. So that patient flow is huge key. Physicians, you want physicians who are going to want to look and evaluate every patient who comes in as a potential patient who can come onto that study and onto that trial. But oftentimes you also want to engage regionally through doctor referral letters or referral programs as well. So if it's a hard to find patient population, that can be really key as well. Those doctor-to-doctor referrals saying, hey guys, I'm a fellow doctor in your region. If you see this kind of patient, just let you know I have a trial open at my site. That's a huge part of recruitment programs here in the States. And then depending on the patient population, advertising might be a good fit. A lot of studies will put up study sites. So if it's a type of patient population who goes on and says, I have this indication, what do I do? Well, you can set that up, on the web and have a website that'll pop up. Potential patients can actually then be found directly going to a site and saying, oh, I see there's also a site close by me that I can go and visit and check at. So advertising programs can be a huge part of recruitment depending on your patient population.
And there are specific agencies that specialize in clinical trial advertisement. That's what they do. And so they can kind of strategically figure out what's the best way to advertise in which area, for which indication, that kind of stuff.
And understanding that, of course, all advertisement must be approved by our IRB. But one other area that we haven't mentioned is, and I've used before, is to interact with patient advocacy groups. So if you're working in multiple sclerosis, for example, you'd want to make sure that the multiple sclerosis organizations know about your study and they can post a reference to it.
Or send out postcards or something like that.
What about Facebook? Is that usable?
That too.
It is, but of course, again, IRB approved.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. So now let's move on a little bit to some of the nuts and bolts related to the actual study. So one of the questions that came in was, and I'll give this to Jay, is there typically a mechanism for pausing and recalibrating a study in the middle if things aren't going to plan?
Yes, you can always do that. A study can always be amended. The damage that it might do to the study you'd have to consider, but certainly you can amend studies. And so that's definitely one of your options. One of your other options is that you can plan ahead of time to do an interim analysis to reevaluate where you stand. And so that's something that may not tarnish your protocol as much as if you have to make a major amendment and do a significant pivot in the middle of a trial. But certainly you can do that.
What about a study? Billy talked about this before about doing all the research and all the homework going into this. Matt, what are some tips for ensuring that a clinical study is not going to go up in flames for things that are not, product related? What can fail on the facility side?
Yeah, I mean, one of the best things you can do to ensure success is really have a well-written protocol. It really can't be overstated. Sometimes folks just think that's a simple document. You want to just outline what your objectives are, which is true. You want to make sure it's very clear. But setting the procedures up, setting your expectations in that well-written protocol, making sure that it's easy to understand so that the sites, when they get it, they can actually perform what's being asked of them on that study. So it can't be overstated to have a well-written protocol. And really encourage you to get expert opinion on that protocol as well. So have your KOL review it. Have obviously different study team members review it. Have your CRO review it. So give some feedback on that protocol before you actually launch the study. So make sure it's well thought out and easy to execute. Sometimes there's little things that scientifically you might have even put in there, but operationally they might be difficult to execute. You might be doing something you think is completely an outpatient study, but then you ask something that's going to end up taking your timeline for your study for that normal day into after hours. And it could be as simple as that. It's easy to miss unless you let some other experts really review and weigh in on it and give you some feedback. Other thing really is just having expert people. So whether that's a CRO or hiring someone who understands the clinical space on there, I don't think it can be overstated to really know what you're good at and what you're not. So if you're an expert at designing your product, but you're not an expert at running a clinical trial, then find someone who is. So I think that's really going to help you right up front to make sure the studies run well and executed well.
And as far as running the study goes, you want to make sure that you communicate with your site, so you're in good communication with the facility. You're not just kind of letting them go running rogue, and that you want to meet with a PI at least semi-regularly, depending on the study. You might need to meet with the PI more or less, but you do want to meet with the PI sometimes to keep the study on track and to make sure that, any issues have been resolved. And of course, the coordinator too.
With respect to, if I might add something, respect to letting them run rogue, for medical devices, the company is there for every procedure. 100%. Never heard of anybody doing it otherwise. So the company has clinicians that are there. The company people are there. The engineers are there. So you're involved in every case. And one thing we haven't talked about that is paramount is deciding who you're going to do the procedure on. That's one of the biggest screw-ups. And unless you're clairvoyant and can read the tea leaves, you don't know until you start doing patients. And you have to pick that. So if you have a technology, say, for fixing leaky mitral valves, you say, find me patients with leaky mitral valves. That's great because you're making your net so wide. If you show you can fix every leaky mitral valve, then your indication, once you get approved, is for leaky mitral valves. But if you just say, show me leaky mitral valves, it may only work in those where they have a center leak and the leaflets are free and not mobile and there's no calcium. If you say, okay, let's do our trial, but just in patients that have a central leak and the leaflets are free, well then enrollment is 1 in 10 patients with mitral valve disease. That said, the technology will work a lot better, but enrollment will take a lot longer, and then your labeling will just be for those patients. If you go the other way and say, everybody with a leaky valve, then suddenly the results are kind of crappy, enrollment goes a lot faster. So that's the biggest pivot I've seen in our trials, is changing who we're going to do it on after observing a couple bad outcomes. We say, okay, no more patients whose ventricles are bigger than 80 centimeters. No more people who have a deep basilic vein. No more atrial appendages that have the cauliflower morphology. That's 3 different trials where that was an observation we made after a couple bad outcomes. That's the most common pivot. And figuring out who the patient, the perfect patient is, but not limiting yourself and not strangling enrollment, that's the big challenge. Stunned silence falls over the room. Paul, you're on mute.
I am not on mute anymore. Hopefully you can hear me now. Very good, Billy. Thank you. That was good. Thank you. No, that's great. No, it's super advice, and I was going to get to a question related to patient selection later. So that's awesome. Thank you for taking care of that for me. So let's cover one other thing before we switch topics here, and that's a question about diagnostic testing. Some of our companies have diagnostics. And so are there any particular nuances related to diagnostic testing versus a device? So Isabella, you want to cover this?
Yeah, so diagnostic tests, usually you're looking for sensitivity, specificity, accuracy, predictive value, which are slightly different endpoints than you might be looking at in other medical device cases. The other thing with diagnostic tests, and this of course depends on the diagnostic as always, is you might be able to do a retrospective analysis instead of a prospective analysis. So you can get a bunch of data from a database, you can pay for it or negotiate it somehow, and use that data and kind of analyze how accurate your algorithm or whatever it may be is on those patients, whereas most medical devices you want to do a prospective study. The other thing is diagnostic studies are usually not as lengthy, and they might be smaller studies just in general, so less costly overall because you don't necessarily have, a year-long follow-up or something like that.
Great, thank you very much. All right, let's move ahead to a topic I was thinking of before actually as well when we were talking about sites. So offshore collaborations outside the U.S. Billy, what do you think about clinical data coming from outside the U.S.? What's your experience and what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I love it. I favor it. That said, with the EFS program, the FDA is trying to get people to do more of their initial work in the United States. And this is going to sound really dark and sinister, but it's true. If you don't have it right, if you have miscalled your prediction of the future and you go and do a couple patients and have some bad outcomes, it's much better to have them happen in Asuncion, Paraguay than Cleveland, Ohio, because you can go back, fix it, go back there and try again. The United States is pretty unforgiving. If you design your trial correctly, then you never really have a bad outcome. You've always got contingency plans. That said, that doesn't always happen. And failing in Kuala Lumpur or Prague or Asuncion, Paraguay or Panama or Krakow, Poland is a lot better for your prospects for the future than failing in the United States. There's variable acceptance of data done outside the United States, even though the data may be bulletproof, but that's starting to change. We just recently got something through the FDA on the 510K program, the TVA, AV fistula stuff, without doing a single US case. We got the Plurimed Legoo through without doing a single US case. So they're becoming more open to reviewing databases from outside the United States, but they have to be just as stringent as US databases. Follow-up has to be pristine. It has to be Veritas 5x5. I would love to be able to do first-in-mans in the United States, but here's the thing. The risk-to-benefit calculus, if you will, is different in a third world country. So frequently we'll have a new technology and we'll be going somewhere to try it. And one of my partners will say, would you do that on your mother? And I say, well, you raise a good point. Perhaps someday the answer will be yes. I wouldn't have her be the first patient for this, but she's got insurance and lives in Minneapolis. Sometimes for these patients that are in poor parts of the world, they don't have access to health care. Their prospects are very bad. Here's a US team coming in with the newest, most exciting technology that if it doesn't work, will immediately convert to the standard of care and will check on the patient frequently to ensure they do well. That's a really good value proposition for that patient, whereas here in the United States, maybe less so. So I firmly believe, in fact, I've been to Asuncion, Paraguay, maybe 30 times, and there's 8 or 9 different technologies that the first human being I was involved in Asuncion.
It's great. So do you go to the FDA first before you do those OUS studies and just understand what they're going to be looking for?
We definitely should.
Good. Let's talk a little bit about CROs, because we've talked a lot about having a CRO and your CRO should do this, etc. So one of the questions people ask me all the time is, how early do we engage with the CRO? Do we need a CRO for our first in-human study? For our phase 1 study, can we just do this ourselves? When do we need a CRO? So, of course, I know you guys are at a CRO, Jaye and Isabella, but maybe you could just tell us quickly about, how early do you recommend people engage with a CRO? What's the best time?
Well, certainly I would say that we would encourage you to interact with the CRO very early. But I should warn you that not all CROs are set up to do that. Some like to come in once you have just a protocol planned, and they'd love to run that study. Other CROs are a little bit more flexible and are interested in helping you design the study and interact with you with regulatory authorities and the construct in designing the study. I would definitely ask your CRO to review your protocol. It's amazing what kind of insight they'll have with some of the more practical aspects of the conduct of that study. What did I miss, team?
Pretty much covered it. I guess I would just add to that, as Jay was saying, it depends on the CRO and what the CRO's capabilities are and how the CRO interacts with their clients. So if you can have a CRO that you work with from concept and helps you build your regulatory strategy, and then that includes your clinical and go to the FDA and discuss it with them, then they've kind of been working with you from the beginning, and so they really understand your product by the time you're going into clinicals. And that if they're a CRO that works well together, like they're not in silos, then the clinical team is probably already a little bit aware of your product, and they are already used to working with the regulatory person that you've been working with. And so that really facilitates it moving a bit quicker throughout, the pipeline, I guess, to meet all of your milestones.
You can also work with those groups early on getting costing. So if you really need to plan how much your trial is going to actually cost, and that's another advantage to coming early as well. So CRO can start early with that regulatory, but they can also then say, okay, here's where your clinical plan is going to start to look like. Do you need some high-level costs so you know how much to go ask the VC that you're asking for your business plan?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Matt. It does add a lot of value to your business plan to have cost those out in a realistic fashion.
And do you charge to cost that stuff out, or you'll do that, that help with that work in the beginning beforehand?
Proxima will give you those costs free of charge.
Yeah.
That's great. Very good. And what about working directly with the hospital system? That was one of the questions. So can you just work with the hospital system instead of using a CRO? Are there any pros and cons to that?
I think there's a lot you should weigh out when you talk to a hospital system that starts to tell you that they can also act as your CRO or really run that full study. A lot of times sites or SMOs or hospital systems don't have the full suite of services and capabilities that a normal CRO would have to help you execute. So you really just need to weigh those pros and cons. Do you have those capabilities in-house and you just need something to complement, or do you really need a true CRO to actually run your full study and really be an expert at that point for the service that you need? The other part might be a conflict of interest there as well. I mean, you really want an independent CRO to monitor that data. If they are the enrolling site and they tell you that they're also monitoring that data, then they're not really doing a true independent monitoring of the data. So it's just something to consider as well when you're planning out the different studies. You especially want to make sure you've got that rigor at a pivotal study. Make sure you truly have independent monitoring done by you as a sponsor or the CRO doing that on your behalf, not at that site level.
I think one other thing that I would add is I can't tell you how many times in my career I've had an excited emerging company come to me and said, I talked to Dr. So-and-so at Hospital X, and they tell me they can't wait to do my study. And they interpret that, rather optimistically, as they're going to do it for free, and all I have to do is provide the devices. And you would not believe how many times I've heard that. And just don't be disappointed in that situation. That doesn't happen, unfortunately.
That's good to know. I'm glad you guys are saying that because that's important. I actually know a lot of people make that mistake. When someone says they want to do their study, they think they're going to pay for it and do the whole thing, which is not the case. Actually, Billy, maybe I can ask you this question. So in addition to obviously a choice of maybe working with a hospital site instead of a CRO or certainly as an option, what about partnering with strategic? So I know you've got the CDI over there, and that's a unique facility. Are there options, or what are maybe some options for working with a strategic to do a study, perhaps a study maybe that will be necessary for that strategic to decide if they want to continue working with you in some way? Is that something that goes on, and what kind of advice can you give to people?
So working with big companies giveth and it taketh away. And so big companies have a lot of intel. They have the marketing sophistication, they have the connections. I can imagine that might be a good way to do things. I've never done that. We've had strategic investors put money into the companies and take observer roles on the board where they weigh in, but I've never crafted a study with a strategic. They listen to our plan and have strong opinions that we listen to very carefully, but that's the extent of my knowledge on that.
Good, appreciate that. All right, I'm gonna hit a couple other questions quickly. And then we're gonna end the broadcast and go to more live Q&A. So why don't we just talk quickly about regulatory, a couple considerations. So one question that one of the startups had is an IDE or any kind of a clearance from FDA necessary in order to perform clinical testing with a prototype? So Isabella.
So anytime you're running a trial with a device, you're going to be following the IDE regulations. Now, when you talk about an IDE from the, by submitting to the FDA, you need to do that if you have a significant risk device. And we won't go into the details of what that means, but a couple of things is like, is it invasive, and how is the study run? So like to Billy's point, if you have a lot of contingencies in place, if your device isn't working, that reduces the study risk. If you have the standard of care as a secondary measurement to a diagnostic, that reduces the risk. So crafting whether your study is significant risk or non-significant risk is sort of an art in the study design. Of course, some devices you can't help but be significant risk. And then if you do have a significant risk device, then you do need to submit to the FDA. And that would be, you submit your IDE with all the information, your report of priors and things like that. To another point of Billy's, there is a way to do early feasibility studies with the FDA. So these are studies when you're, to this question's point, still in a prototype phase, where you're really trying to learn more things about the procedure or the device's design, or what is your pivotal or pilot study actually going to look like. And you can't really get that information from doing any more non-clinical work, so you need to go do some work in humans. And again, under an IDE, you're still operating early feasibility, traditional, and pivotal under the same IDE. So you don't need to submit new IDE applications every time. You therefore then after do just protocol submissions. And if you are a non-significant risk device, you're not submitting to the FDA, you're going straight to an IRB. The IRB will make the significant risk determination. So you're going to say, I think I'm a non-significant risk device for XYZ reasons, give them a rationale, and then they will either agree with you or disagree with you. If the IRB disagrees with you, then you have to go to the FDA as the final arbiter. And you need to, if you're using multiple IRBs, you need to notify the other IRBs within 5 days.
I think there'd be one thing that I would add, and that I would encourage companies to not be afraid of an IDE. It's not challenging to open an IDE, and so it is not a hurdle that they can't overcome. So don't be afraid of that if you get pushed into that category. And the other thing that I would bring up is something Billy and Isabella mentioned, is that making use of that early feasibility option that the Food and Drug Administration allows now is a great way to make sure that you refine your device as early as possible. So this gives you the opportunity to get a few human cases in to see what kind of device revisions you need before you move in to more expensive studies and bigger commitments.
Can I say a few things about IDEs and pre-market approval studies?
Please, Billy.
I totally agree. I mean, don't be afraid of them because they may create more value for you. There are a lot of technologies that came out where they said, in fact, I've been involved in one where we made the mistake of saying, look, let's apply for a 510K clearance, but we'll say we're for just ligating soft tissue. That's a pretty low bar. We're just leaving in a piece of suture. And the FDA said, okay, yeah, you've got 510K clearance. You are for ligating soft tissue. Then we went out and said, okay, docs, this is for tying off the left atrial appendage. And the FDA came back and said, we didn't give you that labeling. You're not allowed to teach that. You're not allowed to communicate that. You're a soft tissue ligation device. And so we had to go back, lick our wounds, and then do a PMA trial so we could get that labeling. That said, that labeling is super valuable. It increases the value of your enterprise because it's a barrier to entry for others. If it works and you have that labeling and no one else does, that's a super valuable thing that you've done. So don't fear IDEs, don't fear PMAs. It's a way you can create indelible value. It takes work and it takes time and it takes money, but so does everything. And that's a good way to spend it, is getting the labeling you want and the barrier for entry for competitors.
Yeah, great advice. I think people, make that mistake all the time. We see it in all the submissions, a great deal of the submissions to us. We see it in the discussions that we have with startups. Everyone wants to go for that low, super low bar, get approval, and then they figure they'll go into something more valuable later, but oftentimes they burn through their money and they can't, get the evidence then they need to get something more valuable.
And one mistake that everybody makes, and you just made it, Paul, is you get a 510K, the word is clearance.
Yeah,
you do
right.
PMA, the word is approval. So people say, we got approved, we got a 510K. Wait, what is it? Did you get approved or did you get a 510K?
Yeah.
Approval, PMA, clearances. Is
that right?
510K.
Yep, that's absolutely right. Thank you for correcting me on that.
Sorry.
I'll be super aware of it next time. I appreciate it. All right, so we're at the hour mark, so I'm going to wrap up the live portion of our broadcast with just a couple concluding questions, and then we'll stay on privately with our startups and let them ask a bunch of other questions. So final kind of wrapping up question here is, any last piece of advice that you want to give? You've given a whole bunch, Billy. Any other last tips, any things that popped into your head while we've been talking that you're going like, oh yeah, and I want to tell them this too. Any last advice that you want to give, and then I'll hand it over to Proxima as well. So Billy, you start.
Yes. So it's the drunkard's walk. Innovation never travels in straight lines, but if you stick with it, you'll get there. And sometimes while you're doing it, you feel like you're a ship tacking against a headwind. And only once you get there and you look back, you see, God, it was kind of a straight line. So I encourage all of you to read up on psychotherapy, because frequently things go horribly wrong. The wheels come off the cart. You forget some huge thing. You have a disaster. It's all about putting the team together, keeping the team together, saying, come on, guys, we're so close, and doing psychotherapy so that everybody shows up every day at their best. And if you stick to it, then all of your projects, all of your companies will be successful. Just there's nothing cooler than doing that. So I admire you 54 startups for doing startups. It's my favorite thing.
Yeah, me as well. Thank you, Billy. And Proxima team, any last tips, any advice you want to give to our companies and others listening?
Yeah, I think Billy has inspired me. His concept of perseverance is so true. But I could add to his drunkard's walk and say that if you find yourself running in circles, maybe you're cutting too many corners. So Don't cut too many corners. Be realistic. Be realistic. And then the number one thing is spend wisely. Spend your money very carefully.
Yep, I agree with that completely. There's nothing worse than people wasting money. The precious resource they have among other resources. You need money more than air, and when you blow through that money, that's it. And if you haven't generated enough evidence or something validating to unlock that next funding, you're done. So I agree with that wholeheartedly. Well, thank you to the panel for a great discussion, some great tips, some great ideas, and just general advice. So I appreciate that. We're going to end the live broadcast. You guys are going to stay on, so don't disconnect. And let everybody know that we'll be continuing our webinar series, which you can find at medtechinnovator.org/live. That's where you can find the next week's live series as well as the prior installments. So I highly recommend you do that. We'll have some great topics coming up about accessing the market, about M&A strategy, even things like reimbursement. So there's a lot more to come. So we'll cover those in future installments. So thank you guys for your time today, and looking forward to seeing you on the next broadcast.
Thanks, Paul.